Hello everyone who's tuned in. Many thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk to you today. This presentation was first created for a meeting with Maldon District Council's planning team in September 2024. The aim is to provide an introduction to the amazing diversity of wildlife to be found within Maldon District, to showcase the different habitats we have and to discuss the challenges being faced and some of the steps that can be taken to address them. Before we get going, I'll just quickly introduce myself. I'm John Buchanan. I'm a lifelong birdwatcher and I've been enjoying living with my family in Maldon for the past 25 years. Over that period, I've been spending increasing amounts of my time exploring our local areas, and with the help of friends, my interest has spread from predominantly just birds to all aspects of the natural world. Our observations between 2000 and 2020 provided enough material for my book, The Wildlife of Maldon. I'd like to highlight that the wildlife photos in the presentation have all been taken locally within our district. A large number are mine, but I'm extremely grateful to others who've allowed me to use their photos too, to allow better coverage of some of our special species. During this presentation, I'm planning to talk a bit about the historical background to wildlife around us, to go on a tour around the district, talk about the times of change, what's happening with our wildlife at the moment, some of the challenges faced, talk about our priorities for wildlife in the district, talk about solutions, and talk about the overall balance that we need to maintain between people and wildlife. So let's get started. Historical background. Well, 20,000 years ago, the wildlife around us would have looked very, very different. This was a time at Ice Age, where to the north of us there were ice fields, and around about Maldon there was a kind of Ice Age tundra. The kind of species that would have been wandering around would have been those like woolly mammoth, woolly rhino and giant deer. We know these all lived here because some of the remains have been found whilst digging for explorations, archaeological studies prior to the gravel pits being dug out at Lofts Farm. After the Ice Age ended, the first modern humans began appearing around Maldon. It began with Neolithic Stone Age settlers, and after that had the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. Then Romans appeared, and in fact they settled quite a lot around Heybridge, where various remains have been found. And then the Anglo-Saxons, and how artefacts from all these periods have been found in the Maldon area. All these settlers were keen to make the most of natural resources, and in fact over at Bradwell you can see the remains of fish traps that were used in Saxon times. Towards the end of the Saxon period, in 1991, we had the infamous Battle of Maldon. The events were recorded in one of the earliest written accounts of times in those days, and within the battle is the poem is the first mention of wildlife in Maldon, first written mention. I can't read out the Old English version, but the translation explains that both ravens and eagles were seen around the battlefield, possibly feasting on the bodies there. A further picture of the wildlife at the times was painted by Daniel Defoe of Robinson Crusoe fame. He was quite a travel journalist and travelled the country writing books about the sights he saw. And at the Blackwater, he particularly talked about the vast number of wildfowl, duck, mallard, teal and widgeon, that inhabited the creeks at winter, and were a real draw for people from London to come out and shoot, hunt, partly for the sport, but mostly for the food. In fact, around the district, there's still some remnants of the duck decoys that were used to catch ducks at the time. Basically, a big trap would be at one end of a body of water, and they used dogs to drive the ducks into the traps. Throughout the centuries, fishing has continued to be important for people living along the Blackwater, And in the past, there's been some quite considerable fishing fleets and taking part. And here's a snap of the smacks lined up against the prom in Maldon. The Blackwater estuary continues to play an important part for some of our key businesses. And examples here, the salt that's produced and sold worldwide by Maldon Salt Company, and oysters are farmed by Maldon Oyster Company. The Maldon district has hosted a tradition of local naturalists over time. The first book, a comprehensive book about all the birds of Essex, was written by a chap, Miller Christie, back in 1890, who spent a lot of time in the district. And he was friends with E.A. Fitch, Mayor of Maldon, who was president of the Essex Field Club at the time. And perhaps some of you will know his name from Fitch's Crescent, which is the street opposite the prom. Jeff Pyman lived in Maldon. He went to the grammar school, and he was first chairman of Essex Wildlife Trust, a very influential naturalist. He also wrote a version of the Birds of Essex. The most recent version of the Birds of Essex, and by far the biggest and most comprehensive, was written by Simon Wood, who's a very active naturalist living in Heybridge at the moment, and who's president of the Essex Birdwatching Society. Okay, now to take you on a wildlife tour of our district. If you look at a map of our district, what's most obvious from a geographic point of view is the coastline all around it. I have about 75 miles. I know that's a precise number because that's the length of the Saltmarsh Ultra Run from just south of Southwood and Ferris all the way around to Saltcut that takes place most years. Within the coastline, I have predominantly farmland with a few urban areas. The principal urban areas being Maldon and Heybridge, Burnham and Southminster. Let's start by looking at the coast. If you stand on the end of the prom, you can see the estuary at low tide and you immediately see its attraction for birds. Here is a whole bunch of wading birds on the tide line, feeding on mud. Sort of typical birds you might see are black-tailed godwits. They're the larger of the main waders there, and they're eating small crustaceans and worms within the mud. Another species is very common is the redshank. It's slightly smaller than the godwit with sort of characteristic bright red-orange legs and very noisy. My wife calls them clangers. What's been nice around Maldon and the prom of recent winters is that there's been a wintering flock of avocets. These aren't birds that breed here, but they come here and they arrive from East Anglia and just over the continent to spend the winter on the estuary. Other birds you might see, this one's in the summer, is a common tern. It arrives here from Africa to breed, and several pairs breed on Heybridge pits. It was enjoyable watching them as they hover looking for small fish in the river and dive down to catch them. Other things you might spot is samphire. Sort of very obvious at the end of the prom and throughout the estuary. The samphire goes well with sea bass and is also used to flavour the local gin. I particularly like going along the salt marsh at different times of the year to enjoy the different colours of the plants there. Probably the most standout colour is in midsummer when we have the purples of the sea lavender. If you carry along the coast, you'll reach Northey Island, a National Trust property, which is reached by a causeway that is covered in high tide. The sort of main scenery there is the salt marsh and sea walls. The National Trust was doing great work in seawall realignment and trying to increase the salt marsh. Basically, they're breaking the salt of the sea walls so the salt marsh can encroach and rise further up the island. The reason for doing it is with gradual sea level rise, the Warrior's existing salt marsh will disappear as it's squeezed against existing sea walls, and so they need to create new salt marsh. Salt marsh is a very important habitat. It's sort of biodiverse. It's great for young fish and other creatures, and it's a good carbon repository. So here's a sort of picture, rather a muddy picture, but this shows some of the new muddy areas that they have created by breaking the seawall that's gradually being colonized by plants to create a salt marsh. Now, some of the reasons for doing this is for the birds. The Northern Island is a good sanctuary for Brent geese. It's relatively undisturbed. In fact, it's closed during the winter to protect them. There's other birds you can see in the area. There's a lot of other ducks that arrive for the winter. These ones are particularly like. There's two male widgeon on the left and particularly elegant drake pintail on the right. Over the salt marsh, because of the different creatures there's quite an attraction for owls. And when there's short-eared owls about, then the Northey is a good place to try and spot one. Numbers fluctuate year to year. In the breeding areas, they depend a lot on lemmings. And in the good lemming years, there'll be large broods and large numbers of short-eared owls. And we tend to see more in this country. Carrying on along the seawall, we get to Maldon Sluice. And looking off Maldon Sluice, you might have a chance of more maritime ducks. These are red-breasted mergansers. They dive for their foods and catch them. They have saw bills to catch in other words, the bills are toothed so that they can catch fish as they dive underwater. On occasion, you might see other seabirds quite exciting. Here's a couple that we've seen over the years. One's a common guillemot. That has come from the cliff breeding sites in the north of Britain, and a gannet. Going on around the coast, we get to St Lawrence. Now, St Lawrence is sort of special from a natural history point of view. It's within our district, it's the one area where there's still a reasonable amounts of seagrass. Now, seagrass, it looks a bit sad just lying down at low tide, but at high tide, it rises up. It's actually a sort of flowering plant that lives underwater, and the beds of seagrass are very good for wildlife. In some parts of the country, seahorses live in them, good for young fish, and also, again, a carbon repository. And so there's great efforts going on to see how seagrass can be expanded throughout the county, and in particular in St Lawrence they're doing various experiments to see how they might be able to spread the areas. They used to be far more expansive, but in the last century there's disease that hit the seagrass, and in addition there's worries about pollution and competition with algae making the sea less attractive for them. Keeping on going on our tour of the coast, we get round towards Bradwell, and here's a photo of the Shell Beach. They're quite an attractive area, the beach made up of sort of broken shells, and this slightly different habitat attracts different plants. So, for example, it's a place where you can see sea holly. At Bradwell, of course, is famous for St Peter's Chapel, probably the oldest still standing sort of church in the country, and it stands on the outer edge of the Dengie Peninsula, and being the coast and sticking out somewhat, then we get occasional migrant birds arriving. The wheatear here is probably one of the most common passing migrants that come maybe from the north of England, from the hills, or from Scotland, or maybe from abroad. And Bradwell's the sort of place that you might see them. There are also more geese at Bradwell and around the coast towards Deal Hall. Here's a sort of shot of some Brent geese, and for those who can spot it, then right in the centre there's quite a brightly coloured goose. It's a real rarity and nice to see. It's a red-breasted goose. They breed even further away than Brent geese normally, but occasional pairs get mixed up in the Brent goose colonies in northern Siberia, and when the Brent geese migrate over here, they arrive with them. As we go around, we eventually end up in the River Crouch and coming back west. The River Crouch is a great place to see harbour seals. There's a number of colonies there, lovely to see. The reddish colour is caused by sort of iron sediments in the water and the mud end up being absorbed by their hair. And further west still, as I come towards North Fambridge, we reach the Blue House Farm Nature Reserve. This is run by the Essex Wildlife Trust. They've been doing a lot of work there recently to particularly try and make the area better for breeding waders. They've been putting fences up to try and keep the predators out. And the consequence is that they've got some great, well, this summer in particular, they had some great numbers of breeding birds. Top, a bit camouflaged, but I think that's how they're supposed to be. There's a couple of young redshanks and an adult there that have bred there. And on the right, although it perhaps looks like a mallard, this is actually a shoveler, which is a much more sort of scarcer duck, a very unusual breeder within Essex. And you can see this female shoveler duck has got a very healthy looking large brood with it. Right, so now I'm taking around the other way from Maldon over towards Tollesbury. Tollesbury is another Essex Wildlife Trust reserve, and it's a great place for salt marsh and the salt marsh species. And here you can see the old lightship with some waders that look like curlews flying across in front of it. Other species you get there, and particularly in winter, are lapwing and curlew. And it's great that we host wintering populations of these birds, because throughout the country that actually become rarer and rarer as breeding birds. And so the fact that we can offer some sanctuary during the winter months is very good for them. A lot of these birds, though, in fact, are also come from the continent, and particularly in cold weather, we get very large numbers of lapwings come over to our district. And finally, we get to Old Hall Marshes, which is the last stretch of coast within the district, at a large area of marshes and an RSPB reserve. That is very good for a lot of the marshland species, and attracts birds from around the area to feed. So, for example, the duck birds that nest at Abberton Reservoir that come to Old Hall Marshes. A good example are spoonbills. So there's a good place for watching spoonbills. This is quite a flock of them. They're sort of one of the birds that have been arriving into the country in recent years, and in fact started breeding now at Abberton Reservoir. All the waders and other species that winter around our coast in turn attract birds of prey. A good example is a peregrine. There's a nice photo by Simon Wood. Other birds of prey that we have around the district in winter include sparrowhawks, merlins and hen harriers. Now let's head inland and look at some of the freshwater habitats, the inland waterways and pits. Well, the main feature is the Chalmer Blackwater navigation, the sort of canalised river system going from Chelmsford to Heybridge. Here's a photo of one of the western reaches round about Ricketts Lock. Good for wildlife, a very healthy area. Around the banks there's a lot of plants. Here the sort of tall purple ones are purple loosestrife, and in the foreground the little sort of fluffy, slightly lighter flowers are water mint. The canal system is particularly good for dragonflies and damselflies. This is a banded demerswell damselfly sat on a yellow water lily. They're great to see in the summer. You perhaps notice them; those bands on their wings flicker as they fly. Amongst the species of dragonflies, probably the special one is the scarce chaser. This is a female scarce chaser, quite dramatic looking dragonfly. A few years ago, the canal, particularly around Elm Farm Park, was one of the only places in Essex you could go to see these. They've since spread, but nevertheless, the canal remains a hot spot if you want to catch up with them when they're on the wing in June. And coming back from Ricketts Lock towards eastwards towards Maldon, you get to Beeley, and Beeley is an extremely attractive site. It's one of those places that are beloved of photographers and painters, and I think it's something to do with there's lots of things to look at different distances. So you've got sort of the bridge in the background and the weir on the right, and your eyes forever looking around. Very, very attractive, and also attractive for wildlife. A couple of species here. There's a nice family of swans, but on the left there's a sort of speciality of Beeley, the grey wagtail. So perhaps one of the only sites within the district where they breed, and they've bred for some years and often seen hopping about the stones in the weir looking for insects. At the other end of the canal, we get the Heybridge locks. Good for a pub or two, and also for the general scenery and watching the world go by. And again, there's wildlife. And as an example, one winter there was a kingfisher who spent a lot of time around the locks and proved quite photogenic. Now, away from the canal, main bits of water are pits and lakes. And the first one I'll talk about is the gravel pits at Heybridge, which is the area of pits just opposite the opposite side of the river from the prom. And here that you see those islands, they look a bit dotted. Those dots are in fact hundreds of black-tailed godwits who are roosting there at high tide. It's a very valuable place for them to go to because they feed on the mud during the low tide, and as the water levels come up, they like to just flop over the wall onto the Heybridge pits and roost there. In the past, there are avocets nesting there, which is rather exciting to see. Unfortunately, they haven't bred for quite a few years now, due in part to there's a lot of disturbance, unfortunately, around the pit, and also the water levels keep fluctuating. Now, there are other species that are still to be found around the pits. So it's a very valuable site. One of which is bearded tits, very attractive scarce bird you've perhaps seen on Spring Watch and Autumn Watch. It breeds in the reeds there, and the plant on the right, it's not best picture I suppose, but it's one of my pictures. It's actually a lizard orchid, an extremely rare orchid that was found just a few years ago. It's there's only perhaps one or two sites in the whole of Essex where they're to be found. And it's, the reason it's called lizard, I don't know if you make it out, but the long flowery spikes sticking out from the main plant, if you look at them close up, they have a bit of a look of a lizard about them. It's a special plant and it's got special protection because of its rarity. It's on Schedule 8 of the Wildlife and Countryside legislation. Heybridge Pits, due to its closeness to the estuary, is slightly brackish in the nature of the water, slightly salty. But if you go inland, you've got proper freshwater lakes. And spend a bit of time talking about Chigborough Lakes, is a good example. Essex Wildlife Trust Reserve, just inland and quite close to Heybridge Swifts football pitch. The lake is good place to see a lot of water birds, examples of great crested grebes. But the special thing at Chigborough Lakes is the heronry. I don't know if you can spot the sort of white spots within the trees, particularly on the right-hand side, are all nesting egrets. They have colonised this area along with cormorants and grey herons, and I think they particularly like it because this area of trees doesn't have a path right behind it. It's a bit remote, and there's no fishing on the lakes, so there's sort of no disturbance of the water in front. I mentioned some of the species I've been breeding there. More recently, there's been other sightings. The most exciting, which is probably the Chigborough Lakes, the first site in Essex for cattle egrets to breed. And you see on the left-hand picture, there's the 4 first youngsters at the reserve, and looking a bit like the vultures in the Jungle Book cartoon. And last year, right, is a photo of a spoonbill. I mentioned earlier that spoonbills have started nesting at Abberton. It's possible that if they're looking to spread out, they might start nesting at Chigborough as well. There's other sites to see at Chigborough, and one in particular is the best site I know locally for common spotted orchids. Let's move over now to woodland habitat. Within Maldon district, we have relatively little in the way of woodlands. Towards the north, around the Totems, there are some fair-sized pieces. Most of our woods are relatively isolated. In amongst these, though, we do have some gems, some ancient woods that still have a good variety of species within them. A great example of a local woodland is Hazley Hall Wood, just to the south of Maldon. It's good for wildlife for 2 main reasons. Firstly, it really is an old wood. The seed bank has remained relatively undisturbed for hundreds of years, and there's a good variety of native tree species present. And also, the owners, John and Maureen Bissell, as they work within the wood, they do everything they can to improve the habitats for wildlife. A good example is that they carry out a lot of coppicing, and this opens up the wood, creates clear areas for sunlight to reach, and it really benefits the species that like that kind of environment. A good example here is you see all the bluebells flourishing in the foreground of this picture. It's good for sort of classic woodland species, such as here's a nuthatch, but it has specialities, one of which is nightingale. And in fact, most years there's over a dozen pairs of nightingale breeding within the woods. So it's a real sort of a reservoir for this species. In good years, they've been spreading out, and in fact, they spread out along nearby hedgerows, and they now also breed a Maldon wick. Hazley wood is great for other creatures as well, in particular butterflies. Here are 2 classic ancient woodland species that have colonised the wood over the last few years, really capitalising on the habitat improvements there. On the left we have a white admiral, and on the right a silver-wash fritillary. There's other creatures as well. Spent a lot of time, Simon Wood in particular, along with Maureen, have jointly been doing an awful lot of moth trapping, and been discovering the amazing biodiversity of just this one wood. That virtually counted an amazing number of 900 different species of moths now. So all these sort of moths around on this slide, they're all photos of species that have been photographed within the wood, and other things as well. So for example, we have the minotaur beetle. We quite often find them as well as we go around the wood. And as well as animals, there's also other life, and there's a lot of fungi. It's a great place for fungi. They have sort of an annual survey, and so far picked up over 250 different species of fungi there. So Hazley is a very good wood, example of a wood that's essentially oak, hornbeam and ash. But it's not just a matter of having any old wood. Every wood is different. And so I'd like to take you now to Haybridge Wood, and which is sort of now within quite large development, but there's plans in place by the developers to look after it and manage it. And Haybridge Wood is very different. It's up on a hill and it's got a lot of conifers. So a lot of different species are found there that aren't found in Hazley. And to give you another example, let's go to Kentwood. And this picture, a bit hard to make out perhaps, but the creatures within the circles are wood ants. So in Kentwood, which is only a couple of miles away from Hazley Wood, has creatures that have never that we don't come across in Hazley. So we've not seen wood ants there, but they are in Kentwood. So the point I'm trying to make is that it's important to preserve woods, but it's also important to preserve a diversity of woods, because different woods in different places, different soil conditions, different tree species support in turn their own different diversity of wildlife. Next, we'll look at farmland, the sort of the biggest land use within the district. Traditionally, then years gone by, there have been quite a lot of animals, cows, sheep and so on the farmland. And a lot of them actually fed on the salt marsh. But nowadays, most of the farmland is turned over to arable crops, so wheat, barley and so forth, interspersed in some years with other crops. So here's an example. This is a field of lucerne being harvested, which is just one of the fields along Southey Creek. Now, farms vary, and I mean, this is probably the lowest extreme. This is out in the Dengie, the corner of Dengie, and in a way quite depressing. You can see very flat fields, are intensively managed, no hedgerows, quite sparse, not a lot of wildlife. But it needn't all be like that. So here's an example where a farmer is looking after their hedgerows, and in particular the trees as well. This is in fields south of Linebrook Way, where have a good diversity still of farmland birds. The birds, a lot of them like to nest in the hedges, but they like the trees to sing from. So let's talk about some of the farmland birds. Probably the classic one everyone thinks of is skylarks. Here are some skylarks. They nest in the fields, they sing above them, and it's a classic bird. But I'd really like to stress the fact that they are just one of a whole community of farmland birds. They're perhaps one of the most well known and talked about, but there are other species actually really struggling in numbers too. So examples of the species, well, we have cuckoos, the farmland cuckoos, who they like to call from trees where there are trees on the hedgerows, and then find hosts amongst the hedgerows, and particularly dunnocks. And then we have some of the other farmland birds. Here we go, yellowhammers and yellow wagtails, so it's bright yellow birds. Yellowhammers, they are sort of finches, buntings family. They like seeds. They like to nest in the hedgerows. Yellow wagtails need a bit more variety of habitat. They like wet areas, ditches, as well as the fields themselves. Both are declining. And yellow wagtails this year, the only breeding ones I've seen actually on Northey Island. So I think there are still one or two pairs elsewhere around Maldon and beyond, but it's a struggling species. Another species which is not as brightly coloured, but interesting species, and nice. They have a good song. Corn buntings have a jangly song that they sing when perched on fence posts and tops of bushes. And again, a species that's struggling within the district. So as well as birds, there's other species as well that try and survive despite the intensification of agriculture. And there's a set of plants, they're known as sort of arable wildflowers, that where there's odd corners away from the herbicides, they eke out a living. These two are sort of interesting. They're small, but when you sort of get down on your knees and have a look at them, they're attractive plants. One is field pansy, and the other right is the somewhat elusive, I suppose, scarlet pimpernel. And other creatures, the farmland foxes is good for foxes, and also brown hares. And in fact, the district has got a very good population of brown hares. There's many places where they're seen in quite good numbers. You just got to be a bit careful not publicising where they are, because unfortunately hare coursing is quite a sort of significant phenomenon in the southeast of England. And then sort of last of the farmland species I wanted to highlight is one of my favourites, the barn owl. And we still have barn owls around the district. There's a few pairs breeding, always lovely to see, and always brighten a day if you see one flying across in front of you. Next, to talk a bit about the town, briefly about the town. So firstly, let's just centre on Maldon and look at a few things there. By the way, this view, if you ever get a chance to go to the top of the Moot Hall, do so, because it's an amazing view. So that you can see all the way to Southend from the top. In terms of birds, well, there's a lot of gardens and garden birds. Nowadays, there's a lot of garden birds. You might often see a sparrowhawk. They've become a garden bird because they like taking the odd sparrow and blue tit from garden feeders, as well as the slightly larger females will go for pigeons, doves. There's species that like our towns, and one species that's colonising Maldon really is sort of spreading into Maldon is the jackdaw. And this is a couple that are in the Hanley Gardens estate. Now, even in the towns, there can be a lot of diversity, and the gardens attract where people plant a lot of flowers there for pollen and so on. You get quite a surprising number of moths. So these are examples of moths sort of taken within the town of Maldon, actually from my garden. And you can see very brightly coloured creatures that are flying around whilst we're inside watching telly at night. So that was a quick tour around the mosaic of habitats that we have within our district. What became very apparent during the last sort of the 20-25 years that I've been studying the wildlife in detail is how much has been changing. It's really been quite shocking, the amount within such a small period of time, how things have altered in terms of wildlife. So I'd like to start by talking about some of the arrivals and new birds and other animals that we see about us. And start off by talking about the birds. So since 2000, you've got 8 species of birds now breeding within the Maldon district that, within Maldon itself, Maldon area in particular, that weren't breeding there before. That includes sort of titties, warblers, little egrets, bearded tits, cormorants, herringbells, and so on. You can read the list. But a lot of this is to do with climate change. It's on average, warmer summers, milder winters means that birds are spread. So quite a number of these, and the little egret is a great example. You can actually chart its spread northwards through Europe and through France and the Netherlands up to the Channel, and then they spread and seem quite happy around Maldon to breed. They breed here, and in the winter you'll still see them. If it's a really hard winter, then they move out, might move back to the continent. As well as the new birds that have arrived, we've got some returnees that are nice to see. So if you say take the common buzzard that was more or less wiped out through much of England by gamekeepers in past years, has now returned, is now breeding in the district. We've also got a duck started breeding now again, the common pochard. Nuthatch has moved back in, and have the red kite, which is the most recent of the returnees, and just in the last couple of years or so started breeding within the district. So let's look at some of these birds. Well, this is a little egret. It's a now familiar white bird you see all over the place, looking like a small heron. I mentioned earlier the cattle egret. It's just started breeding here. Here's an adult, slightly buffy sort of breast and top of his head, but the main identification feature is it's next to a cow. Cattle egrets are very closely related to man's activities. They're a great global success story from their point of view. They various populations, but in particular the big population in Africa that developed to follow the herds of wildebeest and other grazing animals around, and they quickly reckoned that they could equally well follow cattle. What they like to do is follow the cattle and sheep, and where the cattle kick up grasshoppers and other insects, then they're there to take advantage. So a couple of birds of prey returnees. These you now quite often see in our skies above the district. They have buzzards and more recently red kites. The main sort of difference being in sort of profile. The red kites, so they've got that forked tail and that you'll see. In my list as well, I talked about gulls. Now, gulls are odd. On the coast, gulls, in particular herring gulls, are actually struggling in numbers. But they've now begun to learn that they can breed on the nest on the warm industrial roofs inland. And this is one of the roofs in Heybridge Industrial Estate. And you see there's sort of 3 lesser black-backed gulls there, and in the middle herring gull. Fortunately, locally, they haven't yet learnt the trick of stealing chips or sandwiches from people on the Prom Park, and hopefully it'll be a while before they learn that trick from their coastal cousins. As well as birds, there's other creatures arriving. And what's amazing for a lot of naturalists is the number of species that aren't even in the books that we bought years ago, because they were not seen as British species. So here's one that a dragonfly, very attractive dragonfly, that's now relatively common in the district. Southern migrant hawk with bright blue eyes, but it literally just appeared. In fact, within Essex, it started appearing at Hadley about sort of 10 or more years ago, and has gradually spread. Other creatures include this wasp spider that sort of spread from elsewhere in Britain. Very attractive spider, doesn't sort of scurry about, it tends to build a web and just sit there. It particularly likes grasshoppers, so it'll create a web across a sort of passageway between grass and wait for grasshoppers to happily hop along and then land in its web. These creatures are just continuing to arrive. So literally sort of a couple of years ago, we had Jersey tiger moths appear, and now they're regular in quite large numbers in some people's gardens. They have spread throughout the country. They were spreading sort of eastwards through Essex, and so they're predicted to arrive. Slightly more unexpected is this firebug. It's a harmless bug, but to people, but they're very attractive. In fact, it was only this year that was first seen within the Maldon district, but within this 1 year, I know at least half a dozen or so different locations where people have found them. They're sort of about ½ an inch long or so, and I say they're harmless, but quite a striking bug to look at. Mammals also have been spreading, and one was particularly welcome to everyone who's not a fisherman or isn't worried about their koi carp, is an otter. So the otters have been around. They were recolonized a few years ago, but were almost impossible to see. They were so wary. I mean, the first ones I saw was out on the canal, involved going out about 10:30 at night and being very patient. But there's increasing daylight sightings, and this particular couple of otters appeared for a few days in front of a hide at Tollsbury Wick. Other mammals as well appearing. There's a polecat are kind of spreading nationally. There's a bit of a reintroduction site in Hertfordshire, and it's thought that the Essex sightings are kind of spread from there. But they look very like ferrets, and they're closely related to ferrets. But this particular large animal has got all the features of a polecat, and we've photographed that at Loss Farm just by Chigborough. And on the bottom right, we've got another species that's colonising, a bit like muntjac. People may be familiar with muntjacs. They are actually originated also in China, like this Chinese water deer, but were held in collections and escaped, jumped the fence. And similarly, the Chinese water deer, for a long time, it was thought that the East Anglian reed beds, the Broads and so on, were the place to go to see them. But they have been spreading around the coast, and this one was saw at Alting, as sort of first in the district, but it's likely that they'll spread more. They are not as worrisome for gardeners as muntjac. They tend to keep to wetland farmland areas, whereas the muntjacs now, if they find your garden, they'll nibble away at a lot of your prized plants if you're not careful. So many of the species in the last few slides are probably quite welcome additions to our local wildlife. However, at the same time, other species have been arriving that are causing problems. If anyone in the past had a box hedge and wonders why they don't anymore, the chances are most likely due to the caterpillars of the box tree moth. These arrived just a few years ago, and that have caused devastation to the box hedges of the south of England. Another species that's arrived, we've seen locally, is the gypsy moth. Again, it's the caterpillars that are a problem. They're very hungry and eat a wide variety of plants. The oak processionary is a more specific diet. As the name suggests, the caterpillars like oak trees. They can have very large nests of caterpillars in oak trees and cause a lot of harm to the oak tree, even death of the oak tree. It's sufficient of a problem that the authorities are doing surveys to try and find these nests ahead of time before they cause problems, and already they found one and dealt with it in Maldon Cemetery. The big issue with these species arriving with climate change and other means is that they're arriving quickly, and as different species adapt differently, they often arrive ahead of any predators that might have kept their populations in check. So if a new species arrives, it's probably not recognized by the resident wildlife and not seen as something that might be eaten, and perhaps they're wary of it, and so that they can breed unchecked, because the species that might be able to control them haven't yet colonized. Unwelcome plants as well. Floating pennywort sort of covers all sorts of waterways. In fact, in the canal, there's the Chelmer Canal Trust. The virtually #1 main preoccupation is trying to keep the canal clear of floating pennywort. It's something that people had in their aquariums or bought for their garden ponds, and when they sort of decided to give their fish, liberate their fish back, they tend to tip whatever goldfish they have into a canal, river or pond, and if there's any pennywort in the same water, then it just takes hold and grows. And on the bottom right, the Himalayan balsam that is spreading. Very attractive plant, but unfortunately it crowds out any of our native species, and they are kind of arriving along the canal. There's various spaces that are in Millennium Wood, but they are marching down the canal from Chelmsford at the moment, and could be a big problem if people don't go out and actively remove them. So I mentioned about the arrivals. Everything I've just been speaking about all appeared in Maldon in the last few years. And unfortunately, there's an awful lot of other species that we've lost. And in some ways, the loss is much worse than a gain. because if you're losing things, you're losing something that's part of an ecosystem, and so you're probably losing the species dependent on them at the same time. So you can see there's 10 or so species that we lost around the vicinity of Maldon, and some of them are sort of classic species, such as we have things like ring plover, which is a coastal nester, a spotted flycatcher, which used to be in a lot of people's larger gardens, meadow pipit and redshank from the salt marshes, willow warbler from woodlands, and right at the bottom, turtle dove, which is sort of classic iconic species that has now gone from the immediate vicinity of Maldon, albeit within the district as a whole, it's still just hanging on in a handful of places. So this is a spotted flycatcher. This is possibly the last one that bred around Maldon. It's one that was at Beeley Abbey, and since that time we've not heard of any more nesting sites. And I mentioned turtle dove. I mean, they have a lot of struggles. Unlike wood pigeons and collared doves and feral pigeons that just kind of sit about all year round in your garden, eating everything they can, these have a challenging lifestyle. They're migrants. They migrate to northwestern Africa, so they've got to have the right kind of feeding conditions there, which is a problem with climate change. And then they migrate north. They've got to avoid the hunters. There's people in Malta and other parts of the Mediterranean still shooting them. And then when they arrive in Britain, they need a breeding location, also feeding location. And they're quite fussy with their feeding. They only like sort of specific seeds. There's quite an initiative going on to try and reintroduce them in different areas by encourage them to spread, should I say. And there's a lot of farmers who are actually putting in strips of special sort of wildflower seed mix to give them a place to feed. And equally, some of the other pressures are hopefully reducing. Each year, I hope that the amount of shooting is reducing in the Mediterranean. Whether all this will be enough or whether it's too little too late remains to be seen. And other things we lost, I mean, this is an example. This is a moth that I first saw when I first arrived in Maldon. Russ Neve in his garden, he caught it, and I saw it, and I was expecting to see lots more, but actually I never saw another one, a garden tiger. So it's a book that, I know of it because it was in my ladybird books from when I was young as a sort of classic summer species to be seen, but whether it's climate change or timing issues in terms of when it's breeding and when food's available, I'm not sure, but it's disappearing. Other species that may be on the way out, a bit of a worry, like house martin. They used to be everywhere. They used to nest on my house here in Maldon, and they used to be regular in a lot of places. You see them on feeding around housing estates. There are hardly any. I put out a shout out on Facebook this year, and there's only 2 sites now in at Maldon Haybridge where they still breed. There's other places within the district, but the majority of responses I got to Facebook post was that yes, we used to love having them, but they're around no more. Complicated reasons, maybe it's a bit of climate change and moving north, but a lot of it must be that they're aerial feeders, and there are just so many fewer insects in sort of high up in the air than there used to be. With the farming practices, and also with people in their gardens no longer sort of letting the gardens run wild and having instead decking and even worse artificial grass that just reduces the amount of insects. Also an issue with nesting perhaps, in that there's so many people have soffits, plastic soffits and things to replace the very poor quality wooden soffits that are now put on today's houses. Amazing, really, when you think that the classic old Essex architecture, weatherboarding, the wood there lasted for centuries, but nowadays people are being forced to replace their wood, and they tend to replace it with plastic. Small tortoiseshell butterfly, again another species that just seems to be disappearing around us. There's other things that are still clinging on. Rooks are still clinging on. This is a colony that you may have seen if you go to Morrison's in Maldon, and this is just right adjacent to the car park. We've lost other colonies. There used to be some of the number of nests in the Prom Park and in the churchyard by the park, for example. I was a bit worried with all the new housing developments that are on the farmland they used to forage in, that they may struggle, but they still seem to be keeping their numbers up around this rookery in particular, and it's good to see actually them foraging in some of the grassy areas that have been laid around the new housing estates. Something else still clinging on is swifts. Their numbers nationally have crashed, and they're also aerial feeders. Perhaps because they fly further to feed and they're less trouble feeding than the house martin, so they actually feed, they'll travel a long distance to a reservoir if there's a hatch of insects and so on to gather food. But they're losing nesting sites, and a lot of it is to do with this plastic soffits and so on blocking off the entrance ways into people's roofs where they just make a little home for themselves. They do respond to artificial nest boxes though, and so here's an example where Cindy Laws and has sort of taken a photo in her garden where they installed a swift box, and you can see from the picture that the swifts are happily using it. So now on to some more about the challenges faced. Well, I have weather. I've mentioned climate change a lot. There's no doubt that the extreme droughts cause a lot of problems. And this is from 2022. You see Millennium Wood on the left, and on the right is Chigborough Lakes. You shouldn't be able to see any of that mud. It should all be well underwater. I mean, some of the impacts of the changing climate are apparent from the fact that people are now spending a lot of money and think it's commercially worthwhile to plant a lot more vines. I mean, this is Newhall Vineyard, which is actually quite long established at Purley, but right along the Old Thorn Bridge, there are quite a number of new vineyards being set up. But part of climate change is turbulence in the weather systems, which means it's not always hot. We also get cold spells as well. So we've still got winter freezes that happen periodically, and unexpected weather. So, for example, we had this Beast of the East in March. Now, we don't normally get it so cold in March, and that's a problem because March is when a lot of birds start nesting. So this poor cormorant died in the freeze. But had it been earlier in the winter, it could just have flown off to find some area that wasn't icebound. But by March, they begin to start nesting, so it probably felt it had to stay in the area. So, other challenges. Well, increasing human pressures, and the human population Maldon district continues to grow. But the consequence of this, and more people, is that there's more need to look at people's actions more. And here are some examples. Here is a dog running along. That's sort of pretty much where, in the past, the Heybridge pits, we might have seen roosting waders or even breeding waders at one point. And right, we've got jet skis travelling far too fast where they shouldn't be, where this isn't open water, this is Southey Creek, and the salt marsh that they're racing by is where normally wading birds would want to be sat up awaiting the tides, and clearly they're not going to stick around with jet boats whizzing by. Got fire at Heybridge Wood. I think this is inadvertent, but a consequence of someone with one of these disposable barbecues, some kids not realising how inflammable a pine wood is in summer in a drought. And cats. So you've got a very large population of cats around the district, and the problem is, I mean, they're very well fed, but they will hunt in any case, and you'll see them in the evening going along the edges of hedgerows, reed beds, and so on, eating voles and mice and other creatures that really should be allowed to to have a peaceful life, should I say, but it shouldn't be interfered with. And the problem is it also affects the rest of the ecosystem. So one of the issues for barn owls is the reduction in the small mammals, and cats have got to be a reason for that. And of course, also garden birds are often prey to cats. So just a quick example of sort of kind of issues of disturbance. This is at Heybridge Pits. I mentioned earlier about black-tailed godwits roosting up on the high tide, which you can see that, and also there's quite a few geese in this photo. And sort of day later, same time, so the same part of the tide, no birds, but a fisherman instead. There's also new pressures on the land with wind turbines. At Bradwell, an example, which I, as an environmentalist, I'm very keen that we should harvest the power of the wind, but it has all got an effect on the way land is used. And the current vogue for solar farms. This is the one at Hasty Hall Wood. I mean, solar farms, in theory, if they're properly installed with big buffer zones and wildflowers and so on, then they can support wildlife. But you kind of think, why are we using up farmland for these when we have all the houses and factory roofs, warehouses, car parks that could easily have panels fitted to them? So let's get on to wildlife priorities. So we've talked about the diversity of wildlife we have, the mosaic of habitats that we have, and some of the changes going on. In amongst all of that, what are our current priorities? Well, Maldon is a great place for wildlife, and one of the reasons is its location. So we have a huge number of birds arriving from the winter from the north. You can see from Greenland, knot and turnstone, from Iceland, redshank and godwits, thrushes and grey plover and ducks and geese from the northeast. They all come to us for the winter because their own breeding sites are no longer suitable to stay at in the winter time. They need our relatively mild climates that are currently supported by the Gulf Stream that gives them ice-free areas to feed. And then in the summer, the red arrows are showing all the animals all the birds that come to us to breed. And so we welcome lots of warblers. You can see the sort of common tern ringing around from the coast of West Africa, sort of cuckoos from the sort of central African jungles, and sort of swallows all the way from South Africa. Now, of the birds that we have in Maldon, we have a large number of red-listed species. And as I was saying earlier, people tend to sort of focus on one or two species. Particularly skylarks gets a lot of attention in planning terms. But there's actually a whole host of other species that are currently birds of conservation concern are nationally recognised as on the red list. And you can see this from a variety of habitats, but in particular there's a lot of farmland species included. So now I'll look at the main habitat types around the district and talk about what the priorities really are. And starting with the coast. From an international point of view, the key wildlife feature of our district is the Blackwater Estuary, which is internationally important. It's been recognised, it has a number of legal designations as a Ramsar site and a special area of conservation, a protection area and a site of special scientific interest, and all to do with the significant international populations it has, particularly the wintering birds, the dark-bellied Brent geese, the Icelandic black-tailed godwits and other waders, In fact, the last count I've seen, which is in January 2022, there's a record of 220,000 birds recorded as wintering around the estuary. I'd just like to spend a little bit of time on the two most important species mentioned, one of which is a dark-bellied Brent goose. These geese breed in the Taimyr Peninsula and other areas around northern Siberia. The reason we know that is that various researchers, such as Bart Emminger from Holland, has been over there looking at the geese and rounding them up whilst they're molting and putting tags on them so that they can be tracked on their journeys to the wintering grounds. And so we know for a fact that geese that are breeding on the Taimyr Peninsula are wintering on the Blackwater estuary. And there's a sort of family party on the left of the slide that are enjoying the winter sunshine on the Blackwater. The other key species mentioned for the international designations is the Icelandic black-tailed godwit. Again, it's a species that breeds some distance away from us, in this case in Iceland. You can see in the top left corner, it's a photograph taken by researcher Peter Potts of breeding grounds in Iceland. On the right, you can see what that same general area looks like in winter. It's a photo I took out of a plane some years ago, and you can see how snowy it is and why they need to move to find other wintering sites. We know that the particular birds that we have come from Iceland, again from a ringing scheme. I don't know if you can see this picture of a godwit I took in Heybridge Pits. It's got some plastic colour rings on its legs, and this particular individual we know was ringed in Iceland around about 2010, as then seen in Heybridge in autumn and spring. In fact, this particular bird winters in Devon. There's plenty of other godwits actually spend the entire winter on the Blackwater. DEFRA have a magic map system for recording key areas and key wildlife concerns and conservation actions. And using that map, you can see which the priority coastal habitats are around the district. The good news for our coastal areas is that there are in fact a lot of coastal site protections already in existence, as well as the designations already talked about. There's various national nature reserves and other reserves which can be seen by looking at the magic map and looking at the additional layers. Looking a bit more in detail of these protections, we have nature reserves, national nature reserves at Blackwater and the Dengie National Nature Reserve. We have various conservation bodies at reserves, Old Hall Marshes, Tollsbury Wick, Bradwell Shellbank, Blue House Farm, Northey Island via RSPB, Essex Wildlife Trust and National Trust owned. Also have a number of Maldon District Council designated local wildlife sites on coastal areas. And there's various initiatives going on already, such as the Blackwater and Colne Estuary Landscape Recovery Scheme and the Blackwater Partnership, the Essex Coast Recreational Disturbance and Avoidance and Mitigation Strategy, RAMS, as well as a relatively new initiative, Bird Aware Essex Coast. Now let's look at farmland. And again, looking at a magic map, we can look at which areas of the district have got assemblages of farmland birds, and both in arable farmland and grassland. And you can see that all the central areas of the district, which is farmed, have got key habitat for those species. Farmland birds are in real trouble, and if you look at the national picture, this chart shows how populations have reduced by about 50% over the last 50 years. And as well as the average, you can see this band encompasses all farmland birds of 19 sort of specific farmland species. So it's a picture affecting them all. Unfortunately, there's relatively little protection for farmland sites within the district. There's one or two nature reserves that have a small element of farmland within them, where the land is leased out to tenant farmers. There's a bit of farmland, a Blue House Farm, and all the Island National Trust has got some farmland associated with it, and also a bit with Old Hall Marshes. Oxley Meadow Essex Wildlife Trust near Tolshant Darcy has got some good has good wildflower meadow species, but it's not really farmland. So we're really dependent on the actions of private landowners. Fortunately, a lot of them are sympathetic and are doing things to help protect the species they have on their farms, but clearly they've got to work on a basis that keeps them economically viable. The North Essex Farm Cluster is a group of farmers who are jointly sharing ideas and plans and strategies to make environmental improvements, and some of that cluster reaches into the north of our district. It also remains to be seen what will come of the environmental land management schemes, the new grant systems introduced by the government that are aimed at encouraging landowners to improve habitats and help retain the key farmland species. When it comes to woodland, as previously mentioned, we've got relatively little woodland in our district. As you can see on this map, this magic map, the different colours represent different designations. We have ancient woods, replanted woods, orchards, and a bit of wood pasture and so forth. What is worth noting is just to the west towards Danbury, there's a lot of woods next door, so to speak, very valuable woods. A lot of them are reserves, Essex Wildlife Trust reserves and so forth, and they provide a lot of opportunities for connectivity. So where we have woodland opportunities to the west of our district, if we can connect up more with the Danbury Ridge reserves, it allows a bigger reservoir for key species. Of the woods that we do have, a number are in nature reserves, so Shotteeth Wood, Essex Wildlife Trust, and Chigborough Lakes has got a sort of partially wooded area. Also, a lot of them are designated local wildlife sites by Maldon District Council, and they have ancient woodland designations and tree protection orders. However, a number of the key woodlands are under private ownership, and we really are dependent on the owners' actions. Where you've got very sympathetic owners that can do a great deal to maintain the habitat, as I mentioned at Hazley Hall Wood. In other woodlands, there's a concern either the owners perhaps disinterested, or perhaps even worse, they're liable to sell the woodland. And the worst way of doing that is when they sell off woodland in little parcels, where buyers like to think they own a little piece of woodland, but in fact, because of multiple owners of these different parcels of woodland, there's no coordinated approach that can really achieve any effective conservation. And there's also woodland managed by developers. I mentioned Haybridge Wood as an example, which can prove useful, but it can be a concern if the developer doesn't fulfil the promises that have been made. So, having taken you through some of the wildlife highlights of our district and some of the amazing animals and plants that live here, then again some of the challenges being faced, I'm now going to wrap up by going quite briefly through some of the potential solutions and things that may be done in the future to help maintain the wildlife and habitats that we have. One of the key aspects is to work closely with developers to ensure that new developments are carried out in such a way that they can be as sympathetic as possible to the environment and local wildlife. Here's an example from a Handley Gardens estate just south of Maldon off Linebrook Way. There they've had to put in a lot of dikes, ponds and other water courses, in order to help maintain water levels and prevent future flooding of the estate. But it's been done in a way that is, with the reeds growing up now, you can see that actually enhanced some of the environment. And already as warblers have moved in, reed warblers and Chetty's warblers, as well as other creatures such as banded damselflies. Throughout this estate, there's actually a lot of green areas, a lot of open play areas and so on, and that grass has proved attractive to species such as pied wagtails, and also I think you perhaps recall an earlier slide showing a photo of jackdaws. On this slide, I put together some of my own thoughts on important steps to take. Firstly, where you have got good sites, local wildlife sites, etc., it's important to maintain the quality of that habitat and to protect it by buffer zones. Species struggle to survive in isolation, so it's vital to create interlinking habitat corridors to establish larger populations and to mean that species can move between breeding and feeding areas without disturbance. It should focus on species most at risk locally. There's more than just skylarks and great crested newts. There's also some of the other species mentioned in this presentation, in particular farmland birds, that we need to be looking out for. You should use ecological data, which is available from the Essex Field Club, but recognise that records may not be available for little visited sites. So simply because there's no data for a particular site does not mean there's no significant species present. Any surveys that are carried out, particularly by the developers ecologists, need to be comprehensive and cover a range of dates. A one-off visit in the springtime on a cloudy day may simply not record a lot of the species that are present. It's important to ensure that biodiversity net gain proposals from a developer are realistic and can actually be achieved. And finally, we need to make sure that mitigation schemes deliver long term. There's an increasing number of examples throughout the country where actions have been taken, such as tree planting, that after a few years have clearly failed in their intent. So just to take one example, talk a bit about buffer zones. Here is a photograph of Maldon Nature Reserve, which is the old railway line running south from Morrison's. And you can see it's fabulous habitat. It's very good. There's actually nightingales breeding there now, as well as unusual butterflies such as white letter hairstreak. However, right next door, there's a new estate, Handley Gardens again. And there's areas as you walk along the footpath between the Maldon and the new development where it's clear there's no buffer zone at all. And the worry is that the housing is going to be populated by people arriving into Maldon with their cats, their dogs, their children, and the obvious place for them to play and explore is the reserve. So there's no doubt in my mind that this new housing estate will seriously detract from the quality of the habitat and the species present. Hopefully, we've got some useful help on the horizon with the imminent publication of the local nature recovery strategy. All councils in England are obligated to have a nature recovery strategy. In our case, it's been led by the local nature recovery team at Essex County Council, and they've engaged with a very large number of different groups to gain as many contributions as possible. This includes all the local councils, as well as conservation groups such as the RSPB, the Essex Wildlife Trust and the National Trust, along with expert groups such as the Essex Field Club. The strategy includes a lot of advice, suggestions and actions to improve habitats and the specific important species that we have within the county.
But in particular, it lays out areas of particular importance for biodiversity and maps out strategic opportunities. And it's really important that these areas are actively supported by landowners and developers if we're going to have a chance of reversing the decline of some of the species that we are particularly keen to look after within the county. And it's useful for developers to recognise that their biodiversity net gain metrics will be improved if the actions that they plan target the nature recovery strategy priorities. Finally, I'd just like to talk briefly about the need to maintain a healthy balance between people and wildlife. Wildlife brings people together. And a good example is last autumn when we were very lucky that for a couple of days a dolphin swam up the Blackwater all the way to the Queen's Head and spent time feeding on the fish there. And people who were around at the time really enjoyed coming out, looking for it and talking about it. It was really sort of a positive news story in amongst some of the other things that were going on at the time. Another example of engagement of people is that the Chelmer Blackwater Reserve at Ironworks Meadow, that a group of us got together and leased some land from Tesco, raised some funding, put in footpaths and carried out actions to try and improve the biodiversity of the area. And it's brought people together. Over 200 local people have become shareholders of our reserve company. We have regular work parties of lots of people turn up and happy to spend their time improving the area and benefiting from being in the outdoors. And we have family days which bring together people of all generations to investigate some of the creatures that are to be found on the reserve. So the balance between people and wildlife. Well, on the left is a photo of a busy day in the Prom Park. Personally, I think the Prom Park is brilliant. There's so many activities for people. There's the splash park, play areas. There's events that are laid on. There's the fair. It's really allows people to enjoy themselves. But the point is making, on the very same day as I took this photo, I just walked a few hundred yards along the sea wall, and there was virtually nobody, but plenty of wildlife. And this is really the point I'm trying to make, that if we plan for people and the things that they most enjoy, we don't need to rule out looking after the wildlife as well. Right, well, that's now the end of my presentation. I hope you've enjoyed it. And I hope I've been able to demonstrate what amazing wildlife we do have in our district, and how important it is that we do everything we can to maintain the wildlife and habitats, and in fact improve them for the benefit not just for ourselves but for the future generations to follow. I'd just like to quickly thank again those names in the bottom right of this slide who generously provided photographs to help the presentation. If you do have any thoughts, comments or questions, then I'd be very keen to hear them. You can see my email address under my name on the left. All the best and goodbye.